program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University. This is EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel Johnson Center for Political Economy. Now, here's your host, Dr. Dan Sutter.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Slavery was a moral abomination and a great stain on the history of the United States, a nation founded on equality and freedom. The Civil War brought enormous death and destruction to our nation, but it resulted in emancipation and the end of slavery. What, if anything, should our nation do today to rectify this wrong from the past? This question drives the current debate over reparations for slavery, payments from the government to compensate for this wrong. Is this debate merely about using government money to buy votes, or is there an injustice that could be reasonably and properly addressed? Joining me on EconVersations today is Dr. Walter Block, who's the Harold Wirth Eminent Scholar at Loyola University in New Orleans and a senior fellow with the Mises Institute. Dr. Block is a distinguished Austrian and libertarian economist. He earned his PhD in economics from Columbia University, and prior to Loyola taught at Rutgers University, Baruch College, Holy Cross, and the University of Central Arkansas, in addition to also working as an economist with Canada's Fraser Institute. He has written or edited over 25 books and authored hundreds of academic journal articles and opinion pieces. Welcome to EconVersations, Walter.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you, Dan.
We want to start with a piece that you wrote on this question of reparations a few months ago, and you had a very great, I thought, it struck me as a great example to lead off with this, talk about the idea of a stolen watch and how that relates to the reparations debate. So if you could take a moment to explain this perspective on the debate.
Yeah, well, suppose my grandfather stole your grandfather's watch. And then what my grandfather did with your grandfather's watch is he gave it to his son, who is my father, and then my father gave it to me, and now I have this watch. And it's still got your grandfather's picture on it, so there's no question that it was a stolen watch. Well, now what should happen? Should I go to jail? No, I'm not really a thief, although I'm a holder of stolen property, but I didn't realize it. The picture of your grandfather is indistinct, and let's say I'm innocent. But now you come along and you say, hey, Walter, I noticed your watch. My grandfather had a watch just like that. Could I see it? And I show it to you. And then you say, hey, that's really my watch because your grandfather stole it from my grandfather. And let's stipulate that there's no dispute as to the facts. We agree on the facts. Well, should I keep the watch or should I give it to you? Well, it seems very clear to me that I should give it to you. And justice would require that I give you the watch. The government doesn't get involved at all. I just give you the watch, and now justice has been done. A little belatedly, but, you know, what the heck? You didn't discover this until now, and that would be the situation. Now, in slavery, what happened is that the slave master stole something from the slave. Stole his labor, stole his dignity, stole lots of stuff. I mean, it was a despicable situation. And now comes the question, well, should any reparations be made similar to the wristwatch? Yeah. And there are two schools of thought. The extreme right wing says, no reparations. And the extreme left wing says, yes, all whites owe all blacks reparations. Mm-hmm. And I think that the proper libertarian issue is neither. It's neither that no reparations at all are owed, nor is it that all whites owe all blacks money or land or whatever or anything. Why did I reject the first case, the right-wing case, the extreme conservative case? Well, because there was theft. And we libertarians believe that whenever there's theft, there's no statute of limitations on theft. I mean, there's a natural statute of limitations, and that is that the burden of proof is always on, possession is 9 tenths of the law. So the burden of proof is he who wants to get reparations. But but I think it's unfair. I mean, if it was 5,000 years ago, and you can prove that your great-great-great-grandfather had his watch stolen, so what? I don't care if it's 5,000 or 50 years ago. It doesn't matter, as long as you can meet the burden of proof. Now, it's true that there's a natural statute of limitations, namely, the further back you go in history, the harder it is to prove anything. Right. But if you can prove it, then you should be compensated. So I reject the right-wing view. I also reject the left-wing view that all whites owe all blacks reparations, because there are many reasons for this. First of all, slavery started with blacks in Africa. One black tribe enslaved another black tribe and sold the slaves to the whites. So there were bad blacks in the sense that great-grandfather blacks were thieves. And then there were even black slave owners in the United States. Mm-hmm. So they should pay, or their grandchildren should pay, and not be paid. Then there's the question, I'm Jewish. My folk came to this country in 1905, which was long after the demise of slavery. So why should I or my grandparents owe anything? The Irish people came afterward. A lot of people came after slavery, and a lot of blacks came after slavery from the Caribbean, from Africa. So why should they be owed anything in the U.S. context? So I reject both sides. And a lot of times libertarians reject both the right and the left.
Yeah, now, just sorry to get into this. One thing that's particularly, I thought, great about your perspective there is that so often the left-wing approach, the progressive approach to reparations, is just viewing this in a completely eclectic, racist, racial justice perspective, where you've got one group having one race did something bad to the other in the past. But there is a basis to think about, like you said, the injustice that happened here at the individual level. There were some individuals, and they did this tremendous violation of human rights to seize other people and hold them as property. And so if we begin with that and understand that there were some individuals who did this terrible thing and others who were victimized by that, we can sort of see like there is like an individualist as opposed to racial justice or collectivist approach to this problem, and so there is possibly something that we want to try to address.
Absolutely. Look, suppose there's some guy in Harlem, and there's somebody in Louisiana. Pick my state. I'm a professor in Louisiana. And this black guy in Harlem has a Bible or has some proof that his great-great-grandfather was a slave on this Louisiana plantation. And he comes to the court and he says, what should have happened in 1865 was that we have ex post facto law. What's ex post facto law? Ex post facto law is we declare things illegal even though they were legal at the time. The Nuremberg trials in Germany was an exercise in ex post facto law. Namely, the German defense was, we were just following orders. You're supposed to kill Jews. You're supposed to kill blacks. You're supposed to kill gays. And what the Nuremberg trial says, well, we don't think so. We think that that was improper, and we're going to punish you even though you obeyed the law. And we concede that that was the German law. Well, up until 1861, say, it was legal everywhere to have slavery. And yet we libertarians are going to impose ex post facto law and say that even though it was legal then, we think it never should have been legal, and we're going to act as if it never should have been legal. So what should have happened in 1865? What should have happened is that the slave owner should have not gone to jail, but should have been made a slave of the ex-slaves. That would be the radical view. And certainly all of his property, since he's a slave, all of his property is no longer his. It should have been given to the slaves to compensate them. That's where you sort of get this 40 acres and a mule stuff from, because that was roughly their approximation. Let's say this slave owner had a plantation of, 100 acres, and there were 10 slaves. They each should have got 10 acres. And 1/10 of the mules and 1/10 of the farming equipment and all that. Okay, so here's this black guy from Harlem, and what he does is he goes to court and says, My great-grandfather was a slave on this plantation. There were 10 slaves, and I want 1/10 of this plantation. And I think he should get it. Mm-hmm. Or the money, the value of it. That would be a complication. It might be difficult to give him, 10 acres in the middle of the plantation. But in some way, he should be compensated, but not from the government, not from taxes, because we all pay taxes. Rather, this guy whose grandfather was the slave owner, and he should give the value of, say, 1/10 of that plantation to this guy, a black guy in Harlem. And I think that would be justice. So we reject the right-wing view that says no reparations at all. We reject the left-wing view, and we have an individualist view, which is compatible with libertarianism. We're individualists. And that would, I think, be justice.
Now, when we think about the injustice that happened, it seems like we've talked. You've mentioned a little bit about the value of the slaves' labor that was taken from them. I mean, there is also the fact that they lost their freedom, their dignity, their autonomy. The horrible stories of slave families being torn apart because the master wants to sell one slave away. There was that horrible human loss of freedom, but that's the one where it's sort of like, barring a time machine, it's not clear how you could compensate the people who were truly deprived of their freedom for that. So I mean, as much as we might look at that part of the injustice, it's hard to see after more than 150 years later how there's much that can be done. I mean, depending on one's view of an afterlife or anything, maybe they've been compensated, they've received some compensation in the intervening years. But I mean, there's not much that it seems that we can do here, as unfortunate as it might be, because you'd be giving money to people who didn't have their autonomy and freedom and dignity taken away from them. They've never been held as slaves, so it's hard to compensate the actual victims in that case, right?
Absolutely. You can't get blood out of a stone. And what is it? The perfect is the enemy of the good. Mm-hmm. We can't do perfect justice. We can only do the best we can. I mean, 150 years have gone by. What can you do? But the owner of that plantation, the great-grandson of the slave owner, is innocent. He didn't engage in slavery, which is kidnapping, in effect, or long-term kidnapping. He's innocent. All he owes is what he never should have gotten. Now, if there are 10 guys from Harlem, say, each of them can prove that they owned, that their grandparents were slaves, well, then the whole kit and caboodle has to go to those 10 guys. Mm-hmm. The 10 black grandchildren. And this guy never should have got that in the first place, because in 1865, what happened is that his grandfather kept that plantation. Right. He never should have kept that plantation. And justice, to the extent that we can now impose it this late in the day, consists of undoing that based on this fact that it was an unjust law that allowed slavery in the first place.
Now, one issue that would arise here that I think that might be relevant is the idea we have had like 150 years in between here. If somebody had been compensated 100 years ago or 150 years ago, we know that fortunes can be won and lost, and so there are, we have numerous intervening generations here to sort of say, like, if your great-grandfather had received this compensation, there's no guarantee that wouldn't have already been lost, so there have been no inheritance to come down to you today. Simply, is there any issue here that you see with this in terms of, like, well, we simply don't know who would have ended up with this money, especially in a dynamic economy? Somebody could have invested in the wrong business. They could have lost all of their money. So who knows what the path of the trickle down of that wealth over the course of generations might have been.
Yeah, money is very difficult. Land is a lot easier. I mean, there were 100 acres in this plantation. Usually plantations were bigger than that, but 100 is a nice round number. And the land sits there. So you don't have any problem with present discounted value of money and interest rates and money put in the bank for 150 years. And even, 2% is going to amount to a lot more now. But we can sort of cut through all of that and mainly look at the land. because it was the land that the slaves worked on. And according to John Locke, the way you get to own property is to mix your labor with the land. Well, who was mixing his labor with the land? Was it the plantation owner or the overseer? No, it was the slaves. So in justice, the slaves own that land. And with land, it's a lot easier to see. You're quite right. When you start talking about money, well, he could have invested it this way, and he could have gambled it away, and you get in all sorts of complications, which I suppose it's important to talk about that too. But the main impetus or the main lesson I think that the libertarians have to offer both sides is this individualist reparations, namely that land he never should have kept, the slave owner never should have kept, and he never should have been able to give it to his kid, and now the present owner in Louisiana, say, or South Carolina, or wherever it is. And by the way, there was slavery in the North as well. So this applies wherever there was slavery and whatever the burden of proof can be met.
Now, and another issue here would be that as we look across, as we look back in U.S. history, I mean, we fought a civil war that helped end slavery. And so is there any issues that you see in terms of, like, if somebody could say, well, my great-great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War on the Union side to try to help end slavery and was killed in that, and so, is there any offsetting element of having, like, not only were your parents not, or maybe that you have, maybe in your family tree you've got some slaveholders, but also some Union soldiers who fought and died for the cause. I mean, it seems like we get into a lot of pretty difficult questions here.
Oh boy, do we! And there were brothers fighting on both sides against each other. One brother, Joe, was fighting Pete, and they were brothers, and they were shooting at each other. It was just a horrible situation. But I want to take issue, maybe do a little pushback. I don't believe there was a civil war in 1861. Civil war, my understanding, is each side wants to run the whole country. The Spanish Civil War was a civil war because the commies and the fascists each wanted to run Spain. The Civil War of 1917 in Russia was a civil war because the White Army and the Red Army each wanted to run the whole place. More accurately, what happened in 1861 was not a civil war, because each side didn't want to run the whole place. The North wanted to run the whole place, but the South just wanted to secede. And by the way, there was slavery in the North as well. So you can't say, well, it was fought to end slavery, because it was slavery throughout the whole country. And Abraham Lincoln, I owe this to Tom DiLorenzo, a colleague of mine, once said, paraphrase, if I want to save the Union, that's what I want to do. I want to save the Union. And if the best way to save the Union is to end slavery, I'll end slavery. And if the best way to save the Union is to keep slavery, I'll keep slavery. So it wasn't a war to end slavery, it was a war to end secession. Now, happily, it ended slavery also, because from a libertarian point of view, slavery is an abomination. I mean, it's maybe the second worst thing after mass murder that human beings can do to each other. So happily, slavery did end then. So that would be my reaction to that point that you made.
Let me bring up another issue here, and there's a Duke University economist, William Darity, very prominent among economists as a voice in favor of reparations. And he points not just to the Civil War or the failure to compensate the freed slaves in 1865. He also points to the history of Jim Crow and in other cases. There were definitely some instances of economic aggression against blacks after the end of World War II. I mean, the Tulsa massacre was one, often really sort of sparked almost by the success of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. And then following all the way through to redlining with discrimination in housing after World War II that helped keep black families from buying houses that were going to appreciate in value and so forth. Do you see these offenses or actions after the Civil War as part of this equation? And how might we approach this? Would we want to actually try to address things separately, or lump it all into one problem that has to be tried to addressed?
Well, that's a can of worms. That's a very important question, and I would divide it into two. I would say that the Jim Crow legislation was totally unjustified. It acted invidiously against Black people, and the people responsible for that should be sued. And they're all gone now, but their children have wealth that they shouldn't have had, because these people should have had their wealth taken away from them because they should have been in prison for doing that. Right? In other words, I'm a legislator, and I am responsible for Jim Crow legislation, and that is a crime from the libertarian point of view. And I bequeath my possessions to my son. Well, I shouldn't have been bequeathing anything. I should have been put in jail for passing Jim Crow legislation in the first place. Okay, so that's one answer, and then whatever else follows. Black people who are hurt by this should be able to sue my son or my grandson for their wealth. But now the other question is racial discrimination. And here I'm guided by three economists, Gary Becker, my PhD dissertation advisor at Columbia, by Thomas Sowell, and by Walter Williams. And I have to brag a little bit. I think, the only co-author of Walter Williams. I think, I'm not sure, but I am a co-author of his, and I don't think he co-authored anything with anyone else. And what these three people say, and what I think all good economists say, is that discrimination is impotent to hurt the target of discrimination. And therefore, no compensation is owed. For example, we pass a law saying that, Black people can't make a certain amount of money, or we have a minimum wage, or something like that. And then what happens, let's say right now everyone is making $10 an hour. And now we have a law against Black people in the labor market, and this shifts the demand curve for Black labor to the left, and now Black people are making $7 an hour. Well, if everyone is making $10 an hour, we have a theory, the marginal revenue theory of productivity, namely that wages tend to reflect marginal revenue product. And the Black marginal revenue product is the same as it was before the law. The law doesn't change marginal revenue product. So now if you hire a white person, you make no profit, which is fine in equilibrium, there are no profits. But if you hire a Black person, you make $3 an hour. So it's going to undermine that sort of a situation. So I don't think that the reason that Black people make less money than white people is due to discrimination. Again, based on the work of Gary Becker, who won a Nobel Prize, and Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams, who should have won Nobel Prizes but didn't. And I think just based on basic economics, that the refusal to deal with somebody is not a rights violation. Look, you have a yellow tie. I hate yellow ties, and I'm going to have nothing to do with you. Did I violate your rights? No. But I'm discriminating against you because you have a yellow tie. And if a lot of people discriminate against you because you have a yellow tie, well, your wages will tend to go lower than they otherwise would be. But then you'll be more of a bargain. So other people will hire you, and you'll be back where you were before. So the discrimination against yellow tie wearing is impotent to really hurt you. So if you want to find out why Blacks earn less money than whites, you have to look elsewhere.
No. Recently, the state of California, and then I think also the city of San Francisco, have had panels to investigate reparations. And one of this really strikes as kind of odd, because California was not a slave state. There was no slavery that we know of in San Francisco, because those were settled relatively late before the start of the Civil War. If a government, at some level, you could look at the governments of Louisiana, Alabama, other states where there was slavery, and say there might still be some liability here. If slavery didn't occur in California, is there really any justification there for like the state of California trying to jump in and give reparations from the state?
Well, I'm only kidding in this response, but I think we were talking about secession before. I think we ought to secede, not all of California, but just the west coast of California, kick them out of the country. They're crazy. I mean, not just on this issue, although they're certainly crazy on this issue, but on so many more issues. I mean, they're just a bunch of left-wing maniacs. Not all of them, not 100%. There are libertarians and non-progressives. I don't think they're progressive. I think they're regressive, but that's another issue. I think this is grotesque. It's just stealing money from people to give to Black people.
Yeah, because I mean, to my mind, it really makes a mockery of the whole idea that there were acts of injustice, and we, you know, perhaps we need to, as best we can, 150 years after the fact, go back and try to do what we can to make up for acts of injustice. You know, to simply turn it into like, okay, we're going to give government money, which ultimately is taxed away from other people. I mean, we're going to give it to some selected citizens and not others. It is really sort of like using this as sort of a cover. And like I said, I mean, to my mind, it sort of really undermines the whole moral force of the question here.
Yeah, I think the government should be colorblind. I know that the lefties hate that word colorblind, but colorblind seems to be an aspect of justice. You just look at people as people, and the color of their skin or their pigment should be irrelevant to any of this.
Well, I think that's an excellent point to make out to raise as well, because I mean, from a libertarian perspective, there's sort of like, why find the whole racial justice and thinking of it all in racial terms so offensive is that you're looking at collectives or groups of people as opposed to individuals. And I think, you know, libertarians would particularly be, you know, emphasizing you need to judge people as individuals. And, you know, and that's sort of like what the market, you know, how it undermines discrimination is by looking at the workers as individuals and realizing this person's marginal revenue product is just as high as this person's. You know, I want to hire the one that's not being valued properly in the market. And so, you know, it's just this whole thing of making sure we focus on individuals as opposed to groups.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So let's see, we only have a little bit of time left. So I was just thinking, anything that we haven't gotten to today that you'd like to share with us on this perspective, on this topic?
Well, I think it's very important to promote liberty and libertarianism, because this is a very contentious issue. And I think that we libertarians have something to contribute that neither the right nor the left has to contribute. And all too often, we're conflated with the right. People think libertarianism is just a branch of right-wingism. And the Federalist Society is guilty of this. And I don't mean in a bad way. They are very nice that they allow libertarians among them, but people get the mistaken impression that we're part of the right wing. We're not part of the right wing. We are unique. We are sui generis. We are the only people who have our finger on the pulse of justice. The right wing and the left wing. I mean, the right wing is okay on economics, not too bad on economics, but horrible on personal liberties. The left wing is horrible on economics, but not too bad on personal liberties. We libertarians are good on both of those areas, and each of those other sides thinks we're inconsistent because, you know, if you favor liberty in one area, you can't favor liberty in the other area. No, we're the only ones who favor liberty across the board. And I think it's very important that this message be gotten out. And I thank you for having me on your show, and we're doing the Lord's work here.
Thank you for coming on, and I thank you all for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.
This has been EconVersations, a joint production of Troy Trojan Vision and the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University.